How old was she when she came to Canada from Italy?
She was 13. So I always I don't know, try to imagine what it would be like to leave sunny, warm Italy. And I've been since to go see the little home where she grew up in the village, and it's fig trees and olive trees and lime trees all around, and you could see the ocean, and it's gorgeous. And then you come to mosquito infested northern Ontario and freezing cold winters. And I don't think they spoke much English, but again, there were so many Italians up there that they got by.
Yeah. I know Steve's father was 13 when he came over as well. And he said to learn the language, they put you in kindergarten class. So he'd be 13 in class with all these little kids. And he said he'd just skip school and started smoking. There is just so many Italians in the zoo.
Yeah, there are.
We actually call her grandmother Nying, which is the Chinese word for grandmother on the father's side of the family.
I call him Grandpa Foot.
We, in our native language, in Hindi, we call them Dada and Dadi.
My other grandmother would be Maman Bozorg, which is Persian for grandmother.
Muchechu means old woman in Kinyarwanda.
Called her Safta, which is a Hebrew word for grandma.
Everybody called her Mami Tita.
We called her Mima and Dede.
Grandma.
Hi, I'm Steph.
And I'm Robin. Welcome to Stories from Grandparents,
the podcast where we share stories about and from grandparents.
Today's episode is about immigration.
Yeah, and this is a theme that came up a lot in Stories from Grandparents. The overarching theme of this episode is moving to find a better life, but there's a number of different routes that people take to get there. Our first guest, Arya, tells his family's immigration story, and their family was escaping religious persecution. In his case, their family was Baha'i, and so he starts off by explaining that background and their family's immigration story, and we hope you enjoy.
The Baha'i faith is a fairly young religion. It emerged in the 19th century from Iran. The Prophet founder was from Iran, in Baha'u'llah, and he was exiled to the Ottoman Empire, to what is now present-day Israel. And the Baha'i faith is, I would say, very generally progressive and universalist, and believes in the equality of men and women. There's a big emphasis on education. There's no clergy in the Baha'i faith, so there's no priest or anything like that. The idea is you should study and learn for yourself and understand the religion yourself and come to your own conclusions, which is one reason why my grandmother, focused so much on education and why that was so important to her. So her family had been Baha'is for a few generations, and a lot of Baha'is would leave Iran and go and try and spread the religion to other parts of the world. And prior to it becoming the Soviet Union, that was Central Asia. There were a bunch of Baha'is who set up in what is now Turkmenistan, Ashgabat. And so her family was there. They had been originally in what is now Azerbaijan. Again, politics changing so much. It used to be Iran, then it was split up and became Azerbaijan, which was, half of it was taken by Russia, the other half Iran. So they were from there, what is Baku today, went to Ashgabat. So let me see. So now back to Ashgabat and the Soviet Union. During the time of the Great Purge, which started in 1936 and kind of continued to 1939, it first started with political dissidents who were sent to the Gulag, and eventually came to religious minorities, and then came to Baha'is as well. And so there was a really big Baha'i community in different parts of Central Asia, including Ashgabat. So at 1939, it just got to the peak where people were being exiled and sent back to where they, quote unquote, came from, which was somehow weirdly indirectly Iran in this case. And so when she came to Iran, there was a big community of Baha'is who were exiled from the Soviet Union. They would kind of look after each other and help each other out. And that's probably how it was a big source of support for her when she first came to Iran. And then to fast forward to her second exile in the revolution in 1979 in Iran, when the Islamic Republic came to power, they saw Baha'is as a threat, even though Baha'is are, I would say, generally quite pacifist, never anti-government. In fact, Baha'is are told not to engage in political parties because it's divisive as an issue. And so I think like generally a low key religion, and Baha'is also don't proselytize, so they weren't out there trying to convert people en masse and, doing any of that. So I think the big issue was they were the largest non-Muslim religion. They were, inherently a religion that didn't believe in clergy. And when you have a theocratic government, that can seem a bit at odds. And the other thing is it's a religion that comes after Islam. And so under certain interpretations, it can be seen as a heretical religion. And so they're apostates. And apostasy in Sharia law is punishable by death. So a lot of Baha'i leaders during the revolution were killed and executed. About 1,000 Baha'is were killed during the revolution. A lot of them fled. There's still about 300,000 Baha'is estimated in Iran today, and they're still persecuted. Baha'is can't go to university. They can't have any kind of government job, which means, being a teacher even, in most cases being a doctor or anything like that. So that's why my parents fled each individually. And I think because my grandmother's husband, my grandfather, was from a fairly prominent Baha'i family, it was even more important that they really leave. There wasn't much choice. And they've never been back. Yeah. I think what was, we always saw her as kind of different from, like I said, from a lot of typical Iranian grandmothers. And she had retained these elements of, Soviet Russianness to her. And I know that one of those was dancing. And apparently, wherever she grew up in the Soviet Union, kids were taught how to dance well. And so whenever she moved to Iran, everyone at parties wanted to see how they danced. And, at some point, at some party, they told, her, oh, we want to see, they would call them the Russians. I want to see the Russians dance. And she said, we are not dancers, as if it's we're not here to perform for you. And she had a very kind of prideful attitude about that. But I think just, seeing those traces of her otherness was always interesting to us, but it was such a removed kind of otherness too, because she came from this place that doesn't exist anymore almost because of how it changed so much. So she met my dad's coworker who was Russian, and so started speaking some Russian to her, and it was so kind of antiquated that it was almost, they could barely understand each other. So you would have these really, she came from a very special kind of place and unique time. But, in terms of trying to think of other stories, just thinking of her kind of coming to Canada as well. And that was, her third country at that point. And she spoke Azeri Turkish, which she still spoke with her sisters. She spoke Persian and Russian, in her own way. And then she had to learn English. And she actually moved to Quebec, so she had to, be able to handle French here and there too. So, she was on almost 5 languages, out of necessity too. And I think there was one time where my mom was trying to get her out of, they moved to some kind of community in Montreal, and she wanted to get her out of her bubble. And so my mom told her, okay, you're going to meet me at school. My mom was going to Concordia. So you'll have to take the metro. And my grandmother had no idea what to do. And I think my mom was, intentionally doing this to kind of push her. And so, she showed up eventually on time to meet my mom. And, right from then, I think my grandmother's whole world was opened up, and she ended up working at a bakery and eventually worked at a department store when they moved to Toronto. And, I think she was somebody who's so adaptable and just kind of, work with whatever situation was given to her.
Our next story is from Brian, who told us about how his grandmother left England for Canada to find a better life for herself, or build a better life for herself.
She didn't always have an easy time doing it, but she did achieve it.
She sure did.
So her name was Rose, and she came to Canada as a young bride in 1911. So she was about 24 years old.
Where was she from?
She grew up in Bethnal Green, which is the East End of London. So she wouldn't be called a Cockney, but the East End of London was kind of, it was a it was a working class area. And if you see pictures of her family, they would be all tradesmen. So she grew up in a community with, sidewalks, street lights, gutters, fairly clean, but it was a working class area. Mm-hmm. So when my grandfather came across and worked, in the grain fields in Western Canada, came back and married her. She had no idea where she was coming to. I mean, she's just a young woman, and she ends up in a small town called Emsdale in northern Ontario. If you can imagine Emsdale in around 1911, there isn't a sidewalk in sight. The roads are mud. This is a lumbering town with some farming. A lot of these towns have kind of disappeared, but at that time, it's where English people were encouraged to move to. Mm-hmm. And there were immigration schemes sponsored by the Canadian government. Yes. The problem was that they were on land that was barely subsistence farming, and very hard to make a living in that area. So her first big disappointment in life was to come to this, very, very rural farming community and live in the back of a store. Grandfather had some kind of, he knew somebody, but very, very rough conditions, right? So she promptly got pregnant with my mom's first sister, Gertrude. And her second big disappointment was that her husband, William, was working in a veneer mill. So a veneer mill peels a log and takes the veneer, the very thin, and it took his right hand right above the wrist. They stuck it in a stump in a tar bucket to stop the bleeding. And he came home with no hand. And in those days, for working class people, if you didn't have a hand, what would you do? Like, literally, that's how men earned a living. Yeah. You can just imagine it. You're pregnant and your husband comes home missing a hand. What do you do? What happened was he was offered 2 sheep for his hand by the mill owner, and he argued with them, and finally he got enough money out of him to buy a kind of a rundown farm on a hill by this little town of Scotia Junction. So the memories I have of her were around this farm on the top of the hill where she raised her 5 children and worked her fingers to the bone trying to fend for her family.
Did she work on the farm?
Yep. And you can imagine that, my grandfather had a hook for his right hand, and he was still able to physically do work. But one of her jobs was they had 6 Jersey cows. So a lot of people don't know about Jerseys. Do you know anything about Jerseys? Jersey cattle, Jersey cows. Well, there's Holsteins, which are the black and white. The Jerseys are the brown and white. Okay. Jerseys have heavy cream. That's why they were valued.
I only know that from like the Jersey milk chocolate bar that they're pictured on.
That's where they come from. Yeah. So her source of income, where she got her own money, was off the milking of these 6 Jerseys. So they had to be, pastured, brought back in. She had to milk them. She had a milking machine, which was basically her 2 hands. She had a cream separator. She had to wash the bottles. So as a young fella, when I was growing up, the milking business had declined. They had a small general store by then. But all those old paraphernalia associated with milking cattle were all stored in the shed. And that's what we got talking about. And that's where I learned about that's how she made her money for the extras in the family. I think she had those dairy cows for maybe 17 years. 5 kids helping out on the farm. It was really hard on her body. They did some lumbering, they did farming, they did anything to survive. So that was one of her stories that I remember, how difficult it was get up in the morning, milk the cows, and just that kind of backbreaking labor to get that little bit of money, because everybody else was doing the same thing. Okay, I mean, everybody had a cow. How would you make any money selling milk and cream? But that's what she did. I mean, she put it. The milk went off in one direction, cream in another. Then they got a little distribution business in the community to certain people. This thought of coming all the way from where there was, you had a pretty good life to where you had to just work your backside off just to survive in an old farmhouse that the pioneers had built. They're living in a house. And the old farmhouse was still standing when I was a young fella. Log that had been, covered with shiplap. You had to get your water out of a well. It was pretty tough conditions. English people are very class conscious. Okay.
What's that mean?
Well, have you ever been to England? No. Okay. So even if you go to England now, people define you by how you speak. Okay. And and certainly this was the case, the way you spoke defined what level of society you existed in. And so they had working class, they had middle class, they had upper class, they had the royalty, but that was very much how people thought of themselves and who they associated with. So what she wanted in life was that struggle to move up from, sort of her working class beginnings into something better. And one of the things that she shared with me is she would have never been able to do that in England because the structures were so strict that a working class person could never move up. They were always considered working class. Whereas in Canada, you, by dint of hard work, or you could get ahead and you could be considered as something better than working class. Not to say that there's anything wrong with working class, but that was her struggle, was to move what she thought was up the social ladder. So they ended up to be small business people. Okay. And for her, that was something. My grandfather became the postmaster in this small community, and for her, that was something that was important to her. My grandmother desperately wanted the girls to move out of that, to go to better themselves, to go to one of the cities but not to remain on the farm, which was for her just mostly backbreaking labor and, a difficult place to make a living.
Yeah, it's interesting because you describe a situation where, she came over from England and just has a really difficult life, a really difficult start to Canada, and has to do this backbreaking work. I think you use work her finger to the bone, and her husband becomes disabled early on in that process. And yet, because of the class system she came from, really she achieved her goal. She was successful.
And she would tell you in her later life, she said, England had held no promise for us. The best thing we did was come to Canada. The best thing.
Because before you had to kind of explain that, I was going to ask you, did she ever want to go back?
Never. She had no desire to go back, because if she had gone back, she'd be treated. And this is, I maybe I'm overdoing it, but my relatives who stayed in England, we saw frequently, and I've stayed with them in England. And what they would tell you is they were always considered working class. They never seemed to get out of that kind of stratification because of the way they talked or whatever. Whereas, for my grandma and grandfather, I guess you would call them moved into the middle class, so to speak, because they had a small business.
And they became, it sounds, important community figures.
Yep. My grandfather ended up as a reeve, right? And even though he had lost his hand, he wrapped it with a cloth and he wrote beautifully. So for people,
I don't know what a reeve is. I'm just gonna.
Reeve is he would be like a mayor of the township.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Wow.
And he was a road foreman. In those days, you were responsible. The province didn't maintain the roads. Okay, you had to. Each of the farmers had a requirement to maintain a section of the road, but you had a road foreman that organized how that was done. Yeah, so, and I guess the thing to, that I would leave with people is that, I think in general, a lot of the grandparents, they just worked we stand on their shoulders, right? They worked so much harder than we'll ever know. Yes. And things were so precarious, right? You didn't have the support systems that you have now. All you had were your friends to help out.
Our last guest today is my friend Mel, who told us a story about her Armenian grandparents. And really, it was a true story of displacement and a lot of it, and how they eventually ended up in Canada at a much later stage of their life.
My dad's father, his name is Kevork Savajan, when Kevork, which translates in English to George, but we called him Dede, D-E-D-E. And my dad's mother was called Mari Savajan, so Mary Savajan, and we called her Mima, M-I-M-A.
Mima and Dede?
Mima and Dede.
That's fun. Yeah. I like that.
So my dad's side of the family is Armenian. My grandfather was born in Eastern Armenia, which is now, Western Armenia, which is now Eastern Turkey. And he was born in 1910. So he was around 5 years old when the genocide happened. So he was like a genocide survivor, which was pretty rare and pretty special.
Can you talk about the context of the genocide?
Yeah, for sure. So during the First World War, the Ottoman Empire was falling apart. And at that time, the Armenians had always been a Christian minority in the Ottoman Empire. And there was a fear that from the Ottomans that the Armenians would conspire with Russia, who's also a Christian country, to kind of overthrow them. So in order to avoid that happening, there was a systemic and deliberate attempt to eliminate Armenians within the Ottoman Empire. And because at that time, the world was quite distracted with what was going on in the First World War, that this corner of the world was not really paid too much attention. So a lot of people had left before, seen signs of that happening. But my grandfather's family, they were from Kershire, I think. And he tells stories about remembering when soldiers came to the door and took away his father and his older brother to be killed. And he was 5 at that time. So I think that experience really drove the narrative for his life, because he was one of the only survivors, but he was also one of the only men who, because he was so young at that time, that came through that. And so he had his mother and a couple of his sisters who had to flee, but they, I don't have the story entirely straight because they went to so many places. And one of his sisters, they actually had to send away to an orphanage because they couldn't care for her, and they were reunited with her years later. They went to Cyprus, to the Greek side of Cyprus at first. And that's where he grew up, and he would sing Greek songs sometimes because that was part of his childhood too. And he eventually ended up in Egypt. They moved to Cairo. So there's a really big Armenian diaspora all over the world because of that period of time. And so that's how my father ended up immigrating to Canada, was from Egypt.
Do you remember any of the stories he would tell you when you were kids?
Oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, so we did have a bit of a language barrier. He spoke mainly Armenian, and so my Armenian is limited. But yeah, I mean, he would tell us stories of like being a boy in Crete, and no, I'm getting the islands wrong. And he was in Cyprus, I think. And he picked up mandolin. He would just like be 93 and pick up a mandolin and start playing mandolin and singing, and like, you know, I don't think he had like an angelic voice, but it was just so sweet to see this elderly man rocking out on his mandolin and having such a nice time. He was a photographer in Egypt.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So that was his profession. And he would have people come to his studio. It was called Studio Diana. And it was on a rooftop that he would take like portraits of people and, you know, like mix the chemicals under the little drape. And, you know, back when photography was a proper form of art, and they had their own retouching room, and my grandmother would help him in the dark room developing them. And yeah, so that was what they did. And like, I just remember him telling a lot of stories about not knowing if they were going to make it through. Like, I don't know, they'd have no money for rent that month, and they'd he's not a hustler. Like, my grandfather was somebody who was just like, I think it could almost be easily like preyed upon by people who might want to take advantage of others. But somehow he always sort of like put his faith in God, and all of a sudden they'd get like an order for something and that would come through at the last minute. And so he told a lot of stories about, he didn't see the world as something that he could control. He saw it as like something that he had to be a part of and ask for help when he needed help.
Yeah.
Yeah. My grandmother, on my dad's side, she is a little bit younger than my grandpa. I think she was 10 years younger than my grandfather. So she wasn't born during the genocide, but she was born in a refugee camp in Iraq. So it was my great grandmother that fled, and she was 13 at the time. And they married her at that time because otherwise they'd be taken away to marry a Turkish soldier or something. So in order to avoid that, they would marry them. And so she was married, and my great grandmother was married, and she actually, I think her husband was killed, and she walked out of, I think they were sent on like a march through the desert, and she actually had to leave her sister and her mother on the side of the road and let them die and carry on. And so she ended up in a refugee camp in Iraq where she met up with her husband's brother, who was one of the only people she knew. And he became my great-grandfather. And so that's where my grandma was born in Iraq. And then they moved around a lot. They went to India for a period of time. I think they were just kind of trying to find their place in the world, and ended up in Egypt as well. And she was the oldest. My grandmother was the oldest of 7 kids. And they had a different experience. I mean, obviously being a woman in a Muslim country, even though they were Christian, like she was always kind of the supporting role. My grandfather was the patriarch. And even though he was this soft, sweet man, he was kind of like the focal point. My grandmother was always there, but she, I wish I had known her better, but she was always there and always loving, but there was always this undertone of depression there. And I think she came out of her experience differently than my grandpa. And that's really interesting to see that, how it affected them differently. Even though like she wasn't directly impacted in the sense of like she didn't experience that, you know, they talk about how pain can get passed through generations. And so, you know, living with her parents who had been affected and having that affect your worldview and your life and your outlook on the world. And also, you know, growing up in a time where I think things like depression and mental illness didn't have any kind of voice. They didn't have any kind of opportunity to be understood. And so I think that's another way where people would turn to faith, because this is like the tool that they have to work with rather than therapy and medication and the things we have now to turn to. So she was an amazing person because she carried on and she persevered, but there was always this like sadness that surrounded her. But it was interesting because as she really moved into her older years and developed like a slight touch of dementia, she started to soften. She started to like give me hugs and like kiss or, crack a smile. And these were things that were so, she showed her love. Like she cooked for us. She loved to have us around. She showed her love. But there was this like cloud of sadness.
Wasn't necessarily through like affection, like
exactly,
affection. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. It came out in different ways. Yeah. So I feel like my relationship with my grandmother was there, but it always, it had to be understood through a certain lens of who she was and what her experience was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She sounds like she has a lot of mystery to her too.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Man.
Yeah.
And like talk about like an ultimately displaced person, right? Like someone born into displacement,
yeah.
And then, like all of the moves after that for her. What year did they come to Canada, or like approximately?
They came they came in the late 60s. And that's the other interesting thing about my dad's side of the family is because everybody moved around so much, they all spoke so many languages because they had to adapt to their local environment. So, they'd speak Armenian and Turkish and Arabic and maybe some Greek sprinkled in there. And there was always this sense of moving around, of the world being a big place, which was such an interesting contradiction to my mom's side of the family, which had been in Canada for a long time, had that Anglo background of being very settled. She never moved her whole life from that one property. So juxtaposing that with this other side of the family that was very aware of the world and had experienced it in difficult ways as well as, happy ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like they restarted, like if my grandparents were in their 60s and 70s, so like they're restarting their life in what a lot of people would be in old age. And, they worked and they always thought Canada was amazing because they just got old age pension checks in the mail. They're like, they're giving us money. Like they thought it was amazing. So they always really felt that this place was such a blessing for them. Yeah.
Where did they live in Canada?
They were in Toronto. So they lived for a number of years with my uncle and his family. And then eventually they had their own apartment in Scarborough, closer to my aunt.
Nice.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the whole family came?
The whole family came together. Yeah. Yeah.
It's really amazing.
Yeah. And I hear stories about like my grandpa working when he came to Canada, like still like as a 70-year-old man. And I think about that now and I'm like, and he was taking like ESL classes when he was in his 90s.
Yeah.
And you think like, I think a lot of people would be like, well, why bother? I'm this far in life.
I am doing nothing when I'm 90. I'll fucking mark my words.
But there's something so inspiring and beautiful about like acknowledging that, your end is within sight at some point and still wanting to learn and still wanting to expand and grow and become more. Yeah.
And not letting your brain atrophy, right? Like not letting yourself get limited. That's what happens to all of us. It's like in different ways as we just atrophy and we're like, can't deal with things that are outside of our realm of knowledge. And it's pretty amazing to want to be learning into your 90s.
Yeah. I think, how we all approach challenge is interesting and so individual. It can be shaped by our upbringing. It can be shaped by so many things. But like you can look at a challenge as like, okay, this is something hard and I don't want to deal with it. Or it can just be like, why does it have to be a challenge even? Why can't it just be something that you go and do and you get as far as you get in your ESL course and you take what you can and that's okay.
Yeah.
I think we put so much pressure on ourselves to have it be something specific that we can label, like I hit this level and I made it to God, this, I don't know,
You're checking boxes. People are checking boxes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They actually immigrated to Canada before, like on a boat, like back when that was still happening. And so they came into Pier 21 in Halifax.
Yeah, nice. My fiance's father came in Pier 21.
Did he?
Yeah.
Yeah. And for the 40th anniversary of my dad's family arriving in Canada, we took a family trip out to Halifax to commemorate it. And my mom didn't tell them at the time, but she had bought a plaque with their name on it. And that's on the wall in the museum. So when we got there, they didn't know it was there. And my mom pointed it out, and my aunt started to cry because
I'm going to cry.
It's
so nice.
There's this... there was this like firm like confirmation of like, now you're a part of something. Because I don't think any of them were ever citizens in Egypt. They didn't want to. My grandfather wanted to avoid military service for the kids, so they never had a home. They never really belonged, and they were always minorities in other countries. And so it wasn't until they came to Canada that they really like became a part of something.
Yeah, and it's this nice confirmation, like you belong here.
Yeah. Exactly.
Thank you for listening to Stories from Grandparents. If you have any interest in submitting stories, or if you want to participate on the podcast, please send us an email at storiesfromgrandparentspodcast@gmail.com.